Department of Labor regulates and how our regulations should be understood and interpreted. For example, both of our agencies use the terms on duty, but it means two very different things between your hours of service or when it comes to compensability from the Department of Labor. We also invited Consumer Finance Protection Bureau to discuss how lease agreements can potentially affect total compensation and how much a driver is really bringing home. We heard from Atri, who confirmed that pay is one of, not necessarily the top, but one of the top priorities for drivers in the surveys that they conduct. Tom Weekly from OIDA gave a really heartfelt speech that I think really brought all of you to the table for this committee, and he discussed the difficulties that you face in working 60 to 70-hour days and not necessarily having a stable or known paycheck at the end of the week. He made a fair point that pay-by-mile structure causes the drivers to be the ones absorbing the inefficiencies in the processes. Finally, the committee also heard from Steve Viselli and Michael Belzer, who have been studying this topic for a very long time. They both echoed prior comments and mentioned that they were glad this study was finally being conducted by the government. So for the study outcomes, we are coming up on halfway through the project. The study is planned to conclude in July of 2024. There may be extensions if needed, but as of right now, we're anticipating that the final report will be issued in July of 2024. And what we've heard from Congress is that they're really hoping for actionable recommendations before the next authorization bill. So while the committee may recommend additional or further research, what we're really looking at here is, are there policy or legislative changes that need to be made throughout the government in this area? So that is the hope for the report. And again, with this structure with TRB, Fmcsa will be kept, we'll find out what everybody else does, what the actual recommendations and findings are. And then I have my contact information.
Great, thank you, Nicole. And as Nicole said, the TRB committee is independent. It's designed that way. We have input, industry has input, labor groups have input as all part of the open meeting process and presenting to the committee thoughts. And as you saw, or if you research the backgrounds of a lot of these committee members, they've done years and years of research in transportation, specifically trucking, many of them. With that said, we have a couple of minutes. If there's a question or two that anybody wants to ask Nicole about her presentation specifically, I'd welcome that question now. Yes, sir. And before, let me try to get you a mic, if possible, just so the rest of the audience can hear you.
Is this on?
Yes.
Thank you, Nicole. So, Cliff Peterson, I write for Overdrive as a blogger, 20-year trucking veteran. I'm also a PhD student doing research in the industry. I'm curious as to why, when I saw the committee members, why you do not have a human factor psychologist or an IO psychologist on there so you can understand the psychological impacts of the compensation.
Let me figure out how to turn that on and off, sorry. So, with the committee, we were able to make recommendations to the Transportation Research Board, and I do believe we asked them to consider human factors as one of the specialties that would be important for this. And I do think some of the committee members may have academic backgrounds in human factors. I'd have to go back and look. But again, we we don't have any say on who actually gets nominated to the committee.
I would just add to that, I wrote that down, I think it's a good question. We have and we continue to provide suggestions on expert testimony, so I'm happy to forward that point through Nicole to the committee chair to say, hey, would you consider having this person present to the committee? So it's a good point. Thank you. Other questions at this point?
I do, over here.
Sorry,
It's
the lights
just
are very
curiosity.
bright today, so I can't really see you. Thanks.
Can I just ask the question?
I just want to make sure everyone can hear the question, that's why I asked you to use the mic.
I'm just curious, your committee members, how many of them have driving experience?
I do not know the answer to that question.
So I do know, Stephen Burks. Yes, I'm sorry, I get Stephen Burks and Steve Vasella's name mixed up sometimes. Stephen Burks is a committee member who does have driving experience. I will say, keeping in mind that committee members cannot have any financial interest in the topic makes it difficult to get drivers who are currently employed on the committee because.
But you could have retired or previous, they've gone out of the driving business, but they
Yeah.
have the experience.
So Stephen Burks is, and again, I do know that the committee has been in touch with Tom Weekly from OIDA, and I know they're interested in, when they get to the point of the peer review of the report, reaching out and seeing if they can have, if any drivers are interested in participating in that process. And I think they're coordinating that through OIDA, is my understanding, just to make it easier to have a focal point of contact.
Yeah, and I would add, they accept applications from interested individuals, and then they do a conflict of interest check. There were a couple of industry participants that didn't get through the conflict of interest check, but they are searching for other participants to fill those roles. And to your point, that includes drivers to retired or otherwise. However, one important aspect of this study is the expert testimony or presentation. So, as Nicole said, Tom Weekly spoke, and we continue to send them suggestions on individuals or organizational representatives that they may want to have present or interview as part of the meeting process. And I think there's going to be a minimum of 6 meetings over the 2 years, so there's ample time for them to accept additional testimony. And I believe the study can be extended 6 months to the end of calendar year 2024 if they have more research that they want to delve into. With that said, the recommendations that come out of TRB can be anywhere from you need to do more research, there needs to be additional data analysis on this, but beyond that, there could be regulatory recommendations to the federal agencies. And as Nicole pointed out, because the direction for this study came from Congress in the bill legislation, the committee can make recommendations back to Congress on legislative changes to improve or facilitate improved safety through compensation methods. So with that, let me move on to make sure we get all our speakers in, and it's a perfect segue into the next study. This was not directed to the agency, this particular study, through the bill legislation, although there was one reference to detention or retention in the legislation. We were already working on setting up this study to follow on a past study, and I have John Mueller here. John is our chief of the research division in Fmcsa, and this is a focus on measuring the prevalence and severity of detention time imposed upon you, the driver, in many different segments, in many different operational environments, and it's a 3-year study. So with that, I will introduce John Mueller.
mentioned, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about this project that we have, the impact of driver detention time on safety and operations. I've organized my thoughts into three main sections. First, a little bit about some of the prior research that's been done in this area. Next, more recently, on a phase 1 study that Fmcsa published in 2014. And then lastly, some details on the study that we currently have underway. So the topic of driver detention is not new. It's been looked at over time quite a bit. Three studies I've listed here for your reference. In 2003, also with the Transportation Research Board, we did a synthesis study. This information is available online and readily accessible. We also looked at it as part of the Motor Carrier Efficiency Study in 2009. And then outside of DOT, the General Accountability Office also looked at this. And while these studies assessed self-reported data from drivers and carriers and safety managers as opposed to like an instrumented data collection. But it's clear that generally, not surprisingly, detention time was and continues to be a high priority issue for the industry. 2/3 of all drivers experience some amount of detention time. And with that comes significant cost impacts. Lost wages, extended drive times, certainly impacts hours of service and things related to that. Some of these studies did identify some causes that looked at potential reasons for it and looked at things like issues with the facility, whether it's staffing or equipment, maybe the number of bays. There were also looked at things, just complications with scheduling and logistics of just the industry in general. And one thing to point out too is these studies all use that unofficial definition of detention time of accepting 2 hours beyond loading and unloading. So just keep that in mind as we go forward, talk a little bit more about that. So more recently in 2014, I've included the link here. There's a lot more in this report than what I'm going to be able to cover today, but there is quite a bit there, and this was again done in 2014. The objective here was to do that more quantitative data collection to understand where this driver detention time is happening and to what degree. It still used the same 2-hour definition, but largely relied on third-party technology and GPS information to determine what was happening in terms of detention. The key findings, some of the key findings here, that 11% of all the stops exceeded that 2-hour window by about an hour and a half. In terms of some of the trends amongst medium-sized carriers had the longest duration as well as the most frequent occurrence of detention time. The truckload, less than truckload comparison, truckload was more frequently detained, but the durations were similar in length to less than truckload and private. And then lastly, on reefer and drive-in, they just had the longest average duration. So there's a lot in the report, a lot of ways that they looked at what was happening. So I just encourage you to get more details there. But like with this study and all of our studies, there are limitations. And we account for those in the report. And a few of them that I just want to point out is that the GPS data that was collected was only from a small number of carriers and was only used to estimate detention time. So it got to be a little tricky to actually figure that part out. There's still confidence in those findings, but just again, some of the limitations that we want to identify. There were an identified and unidentified number of carriers that could, or of operators that were likely working as contractors for medium and large carriers, which could have been the reason why smaller carriers were underrepresented in the data. The GPS data was cross-referenced to driver logs and was only coded for on-duty time, which made it a challenge to actually figure out at the facility how much of that was spent waiting versus how much of that was spent loading and unloading. The goal at the beginning was to look at a lot of different variables in the industry to kind of segment out what was happening, but we were only able to identify 3 or parse the data with 3, and that was the carrier operation size, the operation type, and the freight type. It would have been nice, and we tried to get more information on like the driver type, whether it was owner-operator or company driver. It would have been nice to know more about the facility and the location, the size, different aspects so that we could look at the variable and understand the variables and understand what was happening. Also would have liked to know more about disincentives that may have been in place at the time for detention time. We didn't know much about that in the study. So taking all of that into account, all the past research that's been done, and with this recommendation from the DOT's Office of Inspector General, which was to develop and collaborate with the industry to develop another study to get actual representative data on the frequency and severity of detention time. And so this study, there's 3 focus areas. The first one is to actually perform the study, collect the data, put together the plan to really quantify what's happening in terms of that, again, frequency and severity. Next, with the innovation and developments in the technology that exists, is a way to use some of the ITS systems, the intelligent transportation systems, to more accurately measure what's actually happening. And then finally, bringing all that together in a final report to answer the research questions, offer our findings in the report, and perhaps put out some strategies that could potentially mitigate what's happening in terms of detention. So again, back to the definition, I just want to point out when we started putting this plan together, it became clear if we're really going to do a specific data collection and try to understand what's happening, we needed a better definition to make sure the data that we're gathering, is easy to take and get and analyze. So thinking about it this way, in terms of the total dwell time, the total time spent at the facility, it's composed of these 3 pieces: the loading and the unloading time, the time the cargo is actively being moved or into or out of the vehicle. The other time that's not loading and unloading, but still work-related, paperwork, checking the load or checking the vehicle. And then the leftover piece of that is the detention time. So again, detention time is the difference between the total dwell time at the facility minus that combination of loading and then the active dwell time. And this pie chart here is more meant to help kind of explain the definition. It's not intended to represent what might actually be happening right now. So in terms of the research questions, again, the IG asked us to look at the frequency and severity, and we'll be doing that. Also looking at any fluctuation with the time frame, the time of the day or time of the week that the deliveries are being made. And then on the safety side, the likelihood of crashes that are involved in detention or impacts to hours of service violations or incidents of fatigue. A lot of these questions, at least those first 3, we'll be using that quantitative data collection to help answer. But another piece of the study is on the qualitative side with interviews and participating carriers that we hope to get more information on the cost they experience with detention time in terms of the productivity issues or supply chain problems. And if they are using mitigation strategies for detention time, what are they and how effective are they? Again, on the last 4 questions here, on the ITS side, are there innovations in technology that are out there with some of the telematics systems? Are they able to better accurately measure or capture that in some way? Look at appointment times. If a vehicle has an appointment time versus one that doesn't, does that offer a difference or an improvement? And again, the definition, is it an issue for the industry? Would there be a benefit to having a more standardized formal definition of detention time? And then more distinct on the facility side, are there differences with port terminals versus other kind of facilities? Just trying to understand where those differences happen. So in terms of where we are, the project, as Tom mentioned, we've been working on it for a little bit. It started in July or 2021, the end of 2021, and putting those plans together to kick off the meeting in July of 2022. And since then, we've finished these first 4 steps, mostly the planning of the project and the study design and refining it with a peer review group. And right now, it's in the midst of building this information collection request for submission and approval to the Office of Management and Budget. And now we expect in January of 2024, and on the invitation slide that I did mention, it was only 6 months. This time we're going to be looking at 12 months to try to get more time data and seasonal effects that may occur throughout that year. Using the rest of the time there in 2025, the next 6 or 7 months, we'll do the analysis and understand what's happening, prepare the final report and the briefings and the materials, and then also make a public use data set available for anyone else that may be interested in looking at the data more closely. The goal there is to have everything done by July 2025 or shortly thereafter. A little bit more about Task 6, the data collection. The team is being led by the Virginia Tech Transportation Institute and also includes TDS and Motive and Scopelitis as partners. The goal of this task is to leverage a large number of carriers and vehicles out there that have TDS and Motive, and then to more accurately determine those pieces of detention time definition that I described earlier. The data collection plan is still being formalized and again, subject to the OMB approval. However, the goal here is to have a final sample of 80 fleets and 2,500 vehicles with a medium fleet size of around 4 vehicles. So on the qualitative side though, we want to understand through interviews with the carriers what their detention time costs are, what their experiences are with that, with mitigation strategies they might be using, again, the ITS technologies that are in place, and to what benefit they offer, and then again, talk to them about how they define detention time. Lastly, we'll link the federal crash and violation data with the telematics and ELD data to allow an analysis of the safety benefits in relationship to DOT reportable crashes or moving violations, inspection data, the things that we get from our motor carrier management information system and our commercial driver's license information system. Task 7 is the analysis after the data collection is done. This will be an attempt to answer those research questions to really understand and examine the relationship between detention time and the characteristics, as I mentioned, the carrier size and operation, the facility type and location and size. If there are variations in the time of day or the time of year where it's occurring, and then ultimately, fundamentally, it's the detention time itself, the frequency, the number of detained stops, and the duration and the severity of those stops. And then utilizing the qualitative carrier interviews, supplementing those findings that we couldn't answer through the data to help understand and report those trends with the plots and charts to understand what's there, what the trends are, what significant things that we can see about the data. Lastly is my contact information. You can reach out to me, ask me questions about this or anything else that we have that we're working on. I did want to put a short plug in here for an event that we have coming up in April, and that is our Analysis, Research, and Technology Forum. In that program, you'll hear and get more updates on the product or projects that we have underway in the research division, as well as the analysis division and the technology division. There's a QR code there. I'm not sure if it'll scan, but you can see me after or send me an email, and I'll make sure you get the link to register. It's an online virtual event, but we hope to have some good presentation so you learn a lot more about what we're doing. And it's free to register and free to participate there. So with that, thank you.
Thank you, John. And yes, as John noted, that is it's an event, 4 hour. It's really a review of our research portfolio. And it went off the screen, but hopefully you scan the QR code. Thank you. And it's just a good opportunity to share with our stakeholders, primary stakeholders like you, what research we're doing into commercial vehicle safety. I think these are two good examples. It's the reason I put them first of what I personally call win-win opportunities. And by that, I mean opportunities to improve your working conditions, break down barriers, improve flow, eliminate market failures, but also good for safety. So I will admit, as both the speakers said in their presentations, FMCSA's regulatory authority is limited to, in some respects, to solve both of these issues, but it is our hope that conducting the studies and publishing the reports will raise visibility on what I call these micro market failures, which have permeated, existed for a while, and helping you, again, to reduce barriers to doing your job, but also improve your personal safety and highway safety overall. So the next presentation is on the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse. Brian Price is our Drug and Alcohol Program Manager at FMCSA. Brian also has a wealth of experience, mostly at FMCSA, but also beyond that in industry. 32 years with FMCSA, many different positions. This is obviously not a research study, it is a program, an active program, but something we thought you would be interested in hearing updates on. So with that, I'll bring up Brian.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm I'm gonna hit on 4 topics here real quick related to the clearinghouse. Touch briefly on the background, just to give folks a sense for why the clearinghouse was developed in the first place. I want to talk a little bit about some very recent updates or enhancements we've made to the system as we continuously try to improve what is still just a 3-year-old system. And I think what most folks generally find most interesting is some of the statistics that we see in terms of the types of violations that are reported to the clearinghouse, that kind of thing. Then finally, I just wanted to give folks an update on a new regulation that's been published, but its implementation is coming down the pike that we call the Clearinghouse 2 rule. So just in terms of background, very quickly, one of the things I traditionally like to try and point out was this clearinghouse is something that was widely supported. Industry was actually lobbying Congress for a number of years, saying, basically, we're spending money on drug and alcohol testing, we're doing the right thing to keep our highways safe. But sometimes we'll test a guy, we'll test positive on a random, and then a couple of days later, we'll see that same guy driving at our competitor across the street. How is that happening? Why isn't this guy going through the regulatory return to duty process? So there was an understanding that this clearinghouse would help fill that safety gap, so to speak. So after we published the clearinghouse regulation, our agency set to work on building it. And basically, now what the clearinghouse is, we've established this database in Washington where all these different types of drug or alcohol violations are reported, linked to a commercial driver's CDL number to our database in Washington, okay? And then from there, employers are required to, as part of the pre-employment process, obviously check this clearinghouse to make sure that the driver they're hiring doesn't have one of those positive tests from the past. Another thing that employers are required to do is at least once a year, check the clearinghouse on all the drivers in their roster. Now, a question might be, well, what kind of drug and alcohol violations go into the clearinghouse? Some of this is fairly obvious, like verified positive drug tests, DOT drug tests. Those get reported to the clearinghouse by medical review officers. Someone's had too much Kentucky bourbon, test positive on like a post-accident test or something, BAC over .04, that's going to get reported to the clearinghouse. What we call actual knowledge violations, a good example of that gets reported by employers to the clearinghouse is, for example, if a commercial driver gets cited for DUI roadside in a commercial motor vehicle, those kind of get reported on. But this last category I wanted to kind of highlight here is refusal to test. The reason I wanted to mention this is we're trying to do as much as we can to educate the industry, imploring employers to educate their drivers about what a refusal to test is and what the consequences are. Basically, if a driver has a refusal to test reported to the clearinghouse, it's the exact same consequences as testing positive for methamphetamine and cocaine. They have to go through the return to duty process. And I know from where I sit that, a high percentage of these are, the guy gets selected for a random, he knows he's 30, and he says, well, I'm quitting. That's a type of refusal that doesn't bother me. What does bother me, though, is I see too many instances come across my desk from drivers, it's like, hey, dispatcher said when you drop your load, deadhead over here to Quest, you gotta do a random drug test. So fine, the guy drives over, he parks a little funny, he has trouble parking, he goes in, it's taking too long, and then he's like, oh man, I'm parked, I don't wanna get a parking ticket, I'm parked funny out there. Well, I'll just leave and tell the dispatcher I can do it tomorrow. And those get reported as a refusal. So again, we're trying to do everything we can to and for carriers to educate their drivers on those consequences. We hate to see guys get stuck with those kinds of violations in those instances. Okay, some quick program updates and system enhancements. Just a few weeks ago in March, one of the things we added was if an employer, hires driver Brian Price, say January 1st, and does a query, I look good. If anything is reported to my record over the next 12 months, then that employer that hired me is going to get an email notification that there's new information. You might ask, well, why is that important? That would come up on the annual check. What we heard from industry was they were seeing instances, the clearinghouse used to only provide that update if something new came in within 30 days. But companies were coming to us and saying, hey, I hired driver Brian Price, he looked good, he passed his pre-employment test. Hired him in January. I did the annual query in December and found out he had a positive test. Back in June, I knew nothing about because, you saw that XYZ Trucking was paying a little better, had more home time. He snuck over there and did a pre-employment test, tested positive, and obviously he kept his mouth shut about it, but we had him on the road and had complied with the regulations and did everything we were supposed to do, but knew nothing about it. Well, this new email notification kind of plugs that gap, so to speak. Again, the company queries the driver, anything new is reported to their record over the next 12 months, the company is going to get an email notification. Another quick enhancement, this one's maybe minor by comparison, but one of the things we were seeing from a compliance standpoint, sometimes drivers would get a positive test, they go through the return to duty process, see a substance abuse professional, have that clean return to duty test, get put back on the road. But then we were seeing a lot of employers weren't necessarily conducting the additional follow-up tests. So we just put this little alert symbol on the clearinghouse to try and better highlight that even after that clean return to duty test, there still are additional follow-up tests required. Grab some water. Okay, so let's jump quickly then into what we're seeing in terms of stats. I apologize, I know these numbers are probably can't make them out from beyond the front row. But all this information is publicly available on our clearinghouse website. Right now, just in terms of number of users, we've got right at 3.7 million drivers registered in the clearinghouse, over 400,000 employers, 16,000 third-party administrators, and I could go on, over 2,000 MROs. But what most people are interested in, understandably, is what kind of violations are we seeing? After 3 years and change, we're looking at nearly 200,000 violations have been reported to the clearinghouse. You can see here the calendar year numbers. I don't know if this is, yeah. See here the calendar year numbers for the first year of the clearinghouse, 2020, 2021, 2022. The numbers are going up. Let's just look at 2022 calendar, for example. Out of this bar, out of the 60 some odd thousand violations, over 57,000 of those are positive tests. You might ask, well, what else is it besides the positive tests on drugs? Well, everybody's talking about those refusals. We had nearly 10,000 refusals reported to the clearinghouse in 2022. Again, just an example to show you the volume of violations that were getting reported in the clearinghouse. Again, nearly 200,000 in just a little over 3 years. What are folks tested positive for? Anybody surprised by these numbers? By and large, marijuana is by far the most common drug identified in our positive drug test. One of the things I always point out though, well, two things actually. Let's back up with marijuana in general. Real common question is, what if it's legal in my state? What about medicinal marijuana? If you want to be a commercial driver, still a no-go. You can't, having a medical marijuana card or being recreational legal in your state doesn't allow you to get out of jail free card, so to speak, from marijuana and DOT drug testing. Excuse me. Another thing I point out though with these numbers is that clearly you can see here it is a lot more than just marijuana. In fact, the other point I always make with this data is if you look closely at the numbers and you add up the cocaine, meth, and amphetamine, and you add those together, those three drugs show up in about 3 out of 10, or one in 3 rather, of DOT drug tests. So it's not an insignificant number. Okay, what have been the impacts overall of this drug and alcohol clearinghouse? Well, as of March, the most current data we have right now, there have been over 175,000 drivers have a violation reported. Remember I mentioned we had seen though like 200,000 violations. If you do the math, that means what you might expect. There are a fair number of drivers that get multiple violations reported to the clearinghouse. As of today, there are almost 126,000 drivers in prohibited status, meaning basically if an employer does a query on them or a roadside truck inspector stops them, they're prohibited from operating. They're not supposed to be on the road. You can see here that nearly 50,000 drivers have gone through the return to duty process, are green lighted, so to speak, they're no longer prohibited. Of that 175,000 that have had a violation. Now, one of the things we're continuing to monitor closely and try to keep an eye on is this number right here. You know, there's 126,000 roughly drivers that are currently prohibited. 3 out of 4 of them haven't started that return to duty process. So the question for us as safety regulators is, well, where are they going? So unfortunately, we know some of them go to work for companies that aren't checking the clearinghouse, know nothing about the clearinghouse. That's an issue. But I think sometimes too, it's maybe just a lack of understanding about the return to duty process itself. So we're trying to do more to educate everyone, including the industry, on the fact that there is a return to duty process. And I'm not going to say it doesn't take work, because it does. We're a country of second chances, and sometimes, obviously, mistakes are made, like these refusal scenarios I had mentioned, or even a positive test. But the way the process works, the driver has to go to a substance abuse professional, get evaluated, be prescribed some form of treatment, and then the substance abuse professional declares them eligible for a return to duty test in the clearinghouse. The substance abuse professional actually puts that in. This guy's ready for a return to duty test. Now that doesn't remove the red light from the driver. He's still prohibited. But then the employer will direct the driver for a return to duty test, assuming that comes up clean. The red light's removed, the driver's ready to go back to work, and then the employer has just to take all of those additional follow-up tests. By regulation, a minimum of which is at least 6 observed tests over the next 12 months. So the last thing I'm going to hit on, we okay on time? Okay, the last thing I'm going to hit on is the clearinghouse 2 rule. Now you might be sitting there thinking, well, you got your clearinghouse rule, why do you need another one? What's clearinghouse 2? Okay. So what this is, simplest way I can put it, this is a regulation that's going into effect in November of 2024. It's basically going to establish connections between our clearinghouse database in Washington that I mentioned, and all the state DMVs out there, all the commercial driver's license issuing agencies across the country. And basically through this connection, when a violation is reported to the clearinghouse, we're going to send that information down to the state DMVs, and then by regulation, the state DMVs are going to be required to start a suspension process on the driver's CDL privileges. So you might ask, okay, well, so it sounds like feds and states are kind of teaming up here to create more consequences for the positive test. Makes sense, but don't you already have the red light in the clearinghouse? Like, how does it really help to bring the state DMVs in? Well, you remember I said, some of these drivers may be going to work for companies that aren't checking the clearinghouse. Well, by bringing the state DMVs into the safety equation here, and then actually suspending the driver's CDL at the state level, even if a company isn't checking the clearinghouse like they're supposed to, almost everybody has insurance. Insurance company is going to run an MVR. You can see that that license is suspended at the state level. By the same token, excuse me. By the same token, a roadside officer in rural Oklahoma that may have never heard of the clearinghouse or Fmcsa, if he runs that license and it's English unit, you'll see that the license is suspended for drug and alcohol. So lastly, just to wrap up, as my voice is winding down, apologies for the voice. I had a cut a cold for the first time in forever. We've got a tremendous number of resources on our clearinghouse website, including job aids, depending on what your function is. For most drivers, it's just registering the clearinghouse and providing consent queries. But if you're an employer, you want to know how to conduct queries, how to purchase query plans. We've got job aids for everything. If you're a substance abuse professional that wants to know how you register in the clearinghouse, enter information, all kinds of available resources there. So again, apologies for the voice kicking out there, but I'm happy to take any questions this time.
Thank you, Brian, and we have about 3 minutes for questions. Happy to take as many as we can in our time frame, but please know, this entire team is here throughout today and some into tomorrow. And if you think of a question after this, you can always go to the Fmcsa booth. We have a team there. Pose your question to them. It'll get back to these individuals or myself through that grapevine. So any questions from the audience? And it's a little hard to see. I see one in the back, and I see two over here. Okay, right here.
When I give my consent for an employer to run my background, I'm not opposed to any of this, just to set the premise. You are going to give information to companies all year long on a query. You said anything that pops up after a year. I signed consent to wait for a year. I signed consent to do the query one time. Is there somewhere on there we're going to sign away for the next year that they can just, you guys can just put any information out there? You don't take that wrong. I'm not opposed to it, but you don't have my consent to do that.
Right. You raise a very good point, and in fact, before we implemented this new, we call it the 12-month look back feature, we actually changed the notifications to go to drivers to make it clear that when we do provide consent, that it is for anything over the next 12 months.
It does say that on there.
Yes, sir.
Okay, another question? Again,
What protects the drivers from abuse of the system by a eventual lawyer?
Okay, that's another good question. Okay, when you say abuse of the system, like, I'm guessing an example of that is, okay, driver Price, I want you to take this load, from Los Angeles to New York, and the driver says, well, I'm out of hours to do that, so now you gotta take it. And the driver says, well, I don't wanna be unsafe, so I'm quitting. The dispatcher gets mad and says, all right, I'll show you, I'll just report a refusal to test, clearinghouse. Yeah, unfortunately, I don't know how prevalent that is. We hear it enough to know it probably does happen. And the only thing we can do in those instances, and we have done this, is like reach out to the company to ask for evidence of the actual random selection, like, hey, we need to see, that this driver is actually selected randomly from your drug and alcohol testing pool. The only thing I can say is that in those kind of instances, you can report to us through our National Consumer Complaint Database, and as resources allow, we can look into those kinds of situations for sure. Now, those are kind of things, kind of like these refusals that aren't really refusals that bother us when safe drivers suffer consequences that they shouldn't necessarily have suffered.
All right, I want to be respectful of everyone's time. It's 1:01, so the team will stay up here. If you have questions, come on off to the front. Everybody can get to the next session if you need to. Thanks very much for attending.